I stood in the shadow of the law office, holding the key to a past I never knew existed. The lawyer didn't say a word. He just pushed the heavy box toward me. The mahogany desk felt freezing cold. Inside, the red wax seals on the inheritance papers looked like dried blood. My hands were shaking. I could feel the eyes of the fixer watching me from the hallway. Danger. Every document was a trap. Every line of text was a warning. But I had already taken the first step. There was no turning back now. The rain outside my apartment wouldn't stop, I thought. I was safe behind locked doors. Then came the knock. Heavy, rhythmic, dangerous. When I opened it, the fixer was already stepping inside. He didn't ask for permission. His black leather gloves were damp from the storm. He looked around my small room like he owned it. He threw a single photograph onto the table. It was a picture of my family, but my father's face had been aggressively scratched out with a blade. "Drop the case," the fixer whispered, his voice like dry leaves. He leaned in, so close I could smell the rain on his coat. I refused to look away. He smiled, but his eyes stayed dead. He reached into his pocket and placed a single bullet next to the ruined photograph. A promise, a quiet promise of what would come next. He turned toward the exit, his long coat swaying through the shadows. The door slammed shut, shaking the fragile walls of my reality. I rushed forward, locking every chain, my forehead pressed against the cold wood, chest heaving as panic finally took hold. The midnight hours bled away as I pulled every fragment from the oak box. Maps from 1950 covered the dust-covered floor. Newspaper clippings told stories of accidents that were never accidents. I used my flashlight to cut through the heavy dark, scanning for symbols. There it was, a sign, a strange handwritten mark in red ink, matching the engraving on the golden key. I stood before the wall, pinning the photos, weaving a web of red strings. The threads connected my dead father to an abandoned warehouse by the docks. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died. Shadows rushed back in. I was left standing in the cold moonlight, knowing too much. I couldn't wait for morning. I pulled my black coat tight against the freezing rain and stepped out. The city was a ghost town, drowned in neon and soon moo. My boots splashed violently through wet pavements. The rhythm matching my racing heart, I kept checking my shoulder, feeling the fixer's ghost in every shadow. I gripped the heavy key inside my pocket, searching for a sign. A vintage black taxi appeared out of the dense storm. Its headlights blinded me for a second. I got into the cold back seat without a word. The driver was a shadow in the rearview mirror, silent as a grave. I whispered the destination. We turned into a pitch-black road, leaving the lights behind. The taxi stopped near the rotting docks, and I faced the abyss. The air inside the warehouse tasted like rust and salt water. I slipped through a broken metal door, my footsteps making no sound. The vast space was filled with shipping containers, stacked like giant monoliths. High above, birds were nesting in the broken rafters. I moved from shadow to shadow, keeping the flashlight low. I found the central office chamber, up a flight of iron stairs. Every step groaned under my weight. My hand touched a heavy padlock chain on the door. The golden key fit perfectly. I turned it, hearing the heavy tumblers fall. Inside, a desk was waiting, untouched, for 30 years. I blew a thick cloud of dust off the central drawer. Inside lay a leather ledger bound with black string. I cut the knot. The pages were filled with names, dates, and numbers. My eyes scanned the columns. These were payouts, bribes, systemic cover-ups. Then my heart stopped. Halfway down the page, my father's signature was written in bold black ink. He wasn't the victim. He was the architect. He helped them hide everything. I fell back into the old chair, the weight crushing my chest. Outside, a branch scraped the window glass like a fingernail, reminding me I wasn't alone. The silhouette below did not move. I held my breath, pressing my back against the cold iron railing. A flashlight beam sliced through the dust from the ground floor. It was him, the fixer. He knew I was here. I looked down at the ledger in my hands, the evidence of my father's crimes. I couldn't let him take it. I looked for another way out, but the iron stairs were blocked by his shadow. My pulse hammered in my ears. Step by step, he began to walk up. The metal stairs rang out with a slow, terrifying rhythm. I had seconds to disappear. The office door creaked open, breaking the heavy silence. I squeezed through a rotting wooden panel at the back of the chamber. Dust swirled in the beam of his light as it swept over the empty desk. He knew I had just vanished. I slipped into a narrow ventilation shaft, my skin scraping against the cold tin. Below me, I could hear his slow footsteps, searching every corner. The ledger pressed hard against my ribs, a painful reminder of the truth. I crawled blindly, following a faint draft of cold air. The metal duct echoed with my shallow breathing. Ahead, the vent cover was broken, showing the dark harbor waters outside. I pushed it open and dropped into the night. I hit the wet gravel, rolling to break the fall. The freezing rain instantly soaked through my clothes. Behind me, a loud metallic crash echoed from the warehouse wall. He was already coming, no time. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the leather book under my coat. The labyrinth of the docks was filled with rusty shipping containers. I ran blindly, my lungs burning with every breath. Footsteps splashed behind me, heavy, fast, and unyielding. The fixer was closing the distance. I turned a sharp corner, only to find a massive steel fence blocking my path. I was trapped in a dead end of brick and iron. The footsteps stopped. Out of the heavy veil of rain, the fixer stepped into the alley, his silhouette cut through the pale neon glare. He didn't pull a weapon. He didn't need to. "You have your father's stubbornness," he said, his voice clear above the storm, but he knew when to surrender. I backed against the cold chain-link fence, my fingers cutting into the wire. I held the ledger out, the wet leather dripping. "He helped you build this empire," I shouted. The fixer smiled, a cold, empty line in the dark. "He built it for himself," the fixer replied, stepping closer. "And now, you will pay his final debt." The fixer lunged forward, his movements blindingly fast. I swung the heavy leather ledger, striking his arm with all my remaining strength. The blow landed, forcing him back a step. He growled, his calm facade instantly cracking into fury. Before I could move, his gloved hand gripped my throat, pinning me violently against the steel fence. The wire mesh groaned beneath our combined weight. I couldn't breathe, the air trapped inside my chest. I clawed at his face, trying to break his iron grip through the blinding rain. I saw his other hand reach into his coat, pulling out a heavy steel blade. The metal glinted, catching the pale neon light. Death was inches away. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I used my knee to strike his midsection. He gasped, his grip loosening just enough for me to pull away. The blade sliced down, tearing through the shoulder of my coat, leaving a trail of fire across my skin. I staggered backward, bleeding, but free. The fixer turned slowly, his eyes scanning the mud. The ledger had fallen between us, getting ruined by the wet earth. He stepped toward the book, but I kicked a heavy iron pipe, lying on the ground, sending it straight into his shins. He stumbled, falling to one knee with a sharp curse. I snatched the ledger, threw my body against the weak bottom of the wire fence, and squeezed under into the darkness beyond. I ran without looking back, losing myself in the maze of the waterfront slums. The rain was a protective wall, hiding my tracks from the monster behind. My shoulder was numb, the cold air freezing the blood. I found a derelict, half-collapsed shipping office, its door hanging off the hinges. I slipped inside, collapsing against a pile of old fishing nets. The space smelled of mold and dead sea. I listened intently, but only the sound of the storm filled the void. For now, I was safe. I pulled the mud-soaked ledger from my coat, checking the damage. The ink was bleeding, but the truth was still readable. My father's sins were written in stone. I couldn't run forever. I needed a plan to fight back. The storm finally broke as the first pale light of dawn cut through the cracks in the wood. The harbor outside was calm, but the air was still heavy with tension. I stood up, my muscles stiff and screaming in pain. The fever of the night had passed, replaced by a freezing clarity. I knew what I had to do. The fixer would never stop, and the empire my father helped build would destroy me to keep their secrets. I wrapped the ledger in a dry piece of canvas, tucking it securely under my arm. I stepped out into the gray morning, the city waking up in the distance. The chase wasn't over, but I was no longer the prey. I was the hunter now, and I was going to expose them all. The city limits offered no safety, only a louder kind of silence. I made my way to the neon-lit underbelly, where the digital mercenaries lived. The rain had washed the mud away, but the blood on my sleeve remained cold. I entered a cramped hacker den, hidden behind a broken arcade shop. The air hummed with the pulse of cooling fans and the smell of cheap tobacco. I needed a secure terminal to digitize my father's sins. A quiet technician looked up from his monitors, his face pale under the blue glare. He didn't ask questions. Money talked, but fear talked louder. I unwrapped the canvas, exposing the leather book. "Scan everything," I whispered, "and send it to every major network before they find me." Before they find me, the high-speed scanner hummed, casting a bright green line across the faded pages. Page after page. The crimes of the elite were transformed into unkillable data. I watched the progress bar crawl. 60%, 80%. The technician's fingers flew across the keyboard, building a decentralized shield around the file. Then, the power grid flickered. The overhead lights went black, leaving only the battery-powered screens glowing. A sharp metallic click came from the main entrance door. They had tracked the network signal. The fixer was breaching the perimeter. "We need more time," the hacker yelled, panic breaking his voice. I gripped the steel frame of the table. "Make it happen," I growled, "even if we burn this room down." The heavy iron door exploded inward, torn from its frame by a small charge. Smoke poured into the room, smelling of cordite and burnt plastic. Through the gray cloud, the silhouette of the fixer appeared, a heavy silenced pistol raised in his hand. He didn't hesitate. A streak of fire left his weapon, shattering the monitor next to the hacker's head. Sparks rained down like fireworks. I grabbed a heavy lead-acid battery and hurled it toward his position, forcing him to dive for cover. "Upload complete!" the hacker screamed, hitting the final key as his terminal died. The room went completely black. as I smashed the main server breaker. In the darkness, the hunt became absolute chaos. I didn't fight to kill, I fought to escape. I dragged the hacker through a rear ventilation window, out into the cold morning air of an adjacent alleyway. Behind us, the sound of heavy metal footsteps echoed from the darkness of the ruined shop. The fixer was reloading, but he was too late. The data was already moving across the globe, uncontrollable, unstoppable. We broke out into a crowded public square. Just as the city buses began to roll, the morning commuters were a shield of ordinary lives. I looked up at a massive digital billboard towering over the street. The screen flickered, the commercial vanished. In its place, my father's signature and the financial logs. They began to scroll in giant white letters. The truth was free. The empire fell in hours, shattered by the weight of its own secrets. The fixer vanished back into the shadows, a weapon without a master. I stood on the bridge, watching the sun finally climb above the city grid. The leather ledger was gone, left behind in the ruins of the den. But I didn't need it anymore. The ghost of my father no longer haunted my shoulder. He was not a victim, and I was no longer his protector. I had broken the cycle. The inheritance he left me wasn't money or power. It was the burden of making things right. As I walked into the crowded streets, I knew the battle was just beginning, but for the first time, I was walking in the light.